I will turn it over to Eric to get us going.
Okay, thank you. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm a professor both in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems and the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. And I'm extremely pleased to be introducing Shade Shutters to speak today on a complexity approach to understanding urban resilience. Shade, like many people at ASU, has a fascinating background. His undergrad is in finance, his PhD is in ecology. He also has a postdoc in applied economics, and he's been with ASU since 2002. And over that time, he's worked with ASU, he's worked with businesses, he's worked with government, and he's one of the unique scholars that sort of really makes the School of Complex Adaptive Systems work well, which is where he currently is as an assistant research faculty. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shade for his talk.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. I'm going to now share my screen, I hope. Let's see. And did that work?
Yes.
All right. So as Eric said, I'm a research scientist in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. And my talk changed a tiny bit from what was posted. I reframed it a little bit more about urban dynamics than resilience, but that's not so important. Resilience is still going to factor into it. One of my main interests is cities. How do they function? How do they evolve? What things can we do to make the lives of people in cities better? Well, one word that keeps popping up as I studied cities in the last several years is this word structure. I think most of us hear the word structure and think of a building or a bridge or something that you can touch and see. But urban planners talk about economic structure. And even more generally, a lot of people I work with talk about social structure. But my question is, what does that mean? Social structure, economic structure. Well, today my talk has three parts. The first, I'm going to explain how we make that idea of economic structure more concrete, and then how we use that knowledge to both guide development transitions and to understand changes, the dynamics of urban economies over time. So when people talk about economic structure, these things on the screen are usually what they have in mind. Lots of data, distribution figures, pie charts, bar graphs, essentially how much of each category of something does my city have? For instance, what % of my workforce is in manufacturing? Or how many of my workers have a college degree? Or maybe it's what proportion of my products made in this city end up being exported. These are all really vague notions of structure. And what we do in our lab is we take all that data and we still use it, but we use it in a different way. We apply various techniques from complexity science and network theory and even ecology, and we extract patterns from that data. In particular, we focus on co-occurrence patterns. Do certain pairs of things occur together more or less frequently than would be expected by chance? And those things are economic entities like jobs, industries, worker skills, technologies, even college degrees, and probably a lot of others, depending on what data exists at the city level. So from those patterns, we calculate an interaction between every pair of things that we're studying. So for instance, if you think of occupations, surgeons and anesthesiologists is a pair that occur together in cities a lot more frequently than expected by chance. And that makes perfect sense. You don't want to operate on somebody that's awake, and anesthesiologists don't really have a lot of other clients than surgeons. So it makes sense that those two entities have a strong interdependence value. It's not always like that. A lot of entities have a value close to zero. They just, sometimes they're together, sometimes they're not too much different than random. At the same time, there are pairs of entities that have a negative interaction. Only one of the pair tends to be in a location at a time for whatever reason. We're not sure what all those reasons might be, but for instance, industries of mining and investment banking, they do not typically exist in the same place at the same time, probably partially related to the environment. An interesting one that I came across was that legislators and entertainers tend to not be in the same place at the same time. Could be, they don't like each other for some reason. Not really sure yet, but that's part of the areas of research we're looking into. What I'm going to talk about the next few slides, though, are skills, worker skills that occur together in cities or not together, negatively interacting. So once we calculate and quantify that interaction between every possible pair of some category of thing, in this case, it's skills, we use all those things and their interaction values to construct a network. And in this example on the right, the nodes of the network, the economic things in this network are worker skills. And where they end up located depends on the interaction that node has with every other node in the network. So they have some interdependence or interaction value with every other type of skill. And a massive algorithm calculates all that together and comes up with a network that has some meaning. And in this case, the network is the US Worker Skills Network for 2019. So we're at the point now where I've demonstrated how we turn that notion of structure into something more concrete. And hopefully, if you're still following, you're asking, so what? Well, to me, the key point is that networks are a type of map. I know people often don't think of them that way, but that's how I use networks, as maps. And you can use them in many of the same ways that you would use a traditional map. For instance, you can simply visualize the structure you're interested in, whether it's the US, if you're a geographer, or if it's this skills network, if you're doing the type of work I'm doing. You can divide the map into different areas that have meaning to you. So on the top, this is the US map divided into climate zones. On the bottom, this is the US skills network divided into 3 regions based on the type of skill. You can see that physical type skills are clustered in one area, and technical and cognitive skills are focused in other areas. So we can highlight regions. Another important aspect that these types of maps have in common is that they change over time. With traditional maps, you see changes largely due to politics, war, could even be climate change that's causing the map to change. Well, in our economic map, change is mostly due to shifting technology, new inventions, innovation, but they can also be affected by shocks. So for instance, the pandemic has forced a lot of economic activities to be virtual, and that will inevitably change the structure of our map. We don't know exactly how yet, but that's an interesting aspect that we're investigating now. But I think the most important use for me, and the one I'll talk about the rest of the talk, is that just like a normal map, you can locate things on the map and you can measure the distances between them. So in the map at the top are 3 US cities, and you can see where they're located. You can measure how far apart they are from each other. And while it's not as easy to see that in a network, those same 3 cities each occupy a unique space in the US Skills Network. And just like the cities above, we can actually quantify the distance not only between the cities, but we can identify routes through the network between these cities. Now, there's one really important difference, though, between physical maps and this network map. And that is that I can locate more than just places in my map. A city can be located because it has a set of skills in its workforce, but so does an industry. So I can locate specific industries in my map. So does an occupation. An occupation is a set of particular skills, so it has a location in this map. And so do groups of occupations like green jobs or creative jobs. And very importantly, for the resilience part of this talk, I can locate the same thing at different points in time in my map. So for instance, there's two pictures of Washington, D.C. at different points in time. And between any two things, I can still measure a distance. So not only do I measure a distance between, let's say, Indianapolis and Seattle in this network, like I did in the previous slide, but I can measure the distance between Indianapolis and scientific research and development, or between Indianapolis and green jobs. So that takes me to the first application of two main applications that I want to talk about with this work. The first is understanding and guiding economic transitions. It turns out that economic developers ask a lot of the same questions that a person would ask of a traditional map. But instead of some physical destination, like how do I get to Seattle, economic planners and developers might ask something like, how do I get to a knowledge economy? And then they ask similar questions that a person using a traditional map would ask. How far is it to that economy? How long will it take? And how much is this little trip going to cost me? So these are the uses of the maps, the network maps, in terms of economic transitions. And there's generally two broad reasons, in my experience, that a city might go through an economic transition. First, because it wants to. It wants to change. It wants to enhance the well-being and the economic opportunity of its citizens. Maybe it wants to bring in more tax revenue. But if you ask almost any city planning agency, they have some sort of vision of what they wish they were compared to today. And so in my networks, that is a destination to them. And this is an example of a picture from the economic plan for Medina, Saudi Arabia. They have a vision of being some exotic, green, and knowledge-intensive city. It's a vision shared by a lot of cities. So one of the first things I did with this work was in collaboration with the University of Toronto to explore possible transition pathways for each of Ontario's 17 metro areas. At that time, the government of Ontario was really keen to push their metro areas toward knowledge-intensive economies, and these tools help them identify those pathways. In the picture in the lower right is John Miller, whose team created a decision theater implementation of some of these tools. And so it's a great way for people like Eric Johnston and Margaret Henricks, who do facilitation with stakeholders, to take them through an exercise of being able to play with data and have conversations about possible futures. And these tools allow them to quantify and visualize different scenarios like that. So the other main reason that regions transition is because it has to. Some sort of shock or other change has made their current economic structure non-viable, and they have to transition to survive. And this is a situation in a lot of communities that have been negatively impacted by national energy transitions to clean energy. In countries that are starting to implement policies to slow down climate change, it means closing a lot of carbon-intensive energy sources. So in the upper right is the Mitchell Power Plant, which is about an hour south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was shuttered in the past few years, and with almost nothing left to support the population of the town, it will likely die, or at least it will suffer for generations if it doesn't transition to some new economic structure. And in Germany, the issue is more widespread. I'm doing a lot of work in Germany. It's more widespread because they are further along in energy transition than the US is. On the picture on the left are workers, coal miners that have lost their job in the city of Cottbus, which is in the Lusatian region along the Polish border, which is dotted with coal mines. And it's not just the coal miners that lose their job, but actually for every coal miner, there are 9 other workers in related industries that will be out of work too. And so we not only see these demonstrations and even some riots with police, but there's been a large increase in activities by right-wing extremist groups. And so on the lower left are some tools that we're deploying there in hopes of identifying nearby industries in Germany's network that could rapidly re-employ a lot of those workers in the most painless way possible. It's not easy, of course, but we're trying to find the easiest path forward. And I could talk about that application for a long time. There's a lot of work to do in transitions, but what I want to spend the rest of the time on is talking about using those network maps to understand urban dynamics. By dynamics, I mean measuring changes over time of certain aspects of a city. So recall I mentioned before that among all the different things I can locate in a network map are the same city at different points in time. And in fact, we can do that for several points in time. And in doing so, what we're measuring is how far a city's structure moves through the network over time from some starting point. And so another way to think of that is that we're measuring accumulated change in the city's economic structure. And this is just a cartoonish graph of what we thought we might find. And one phenomenon my colleagues and I examined with this method was how US cities changed in response to a shock. And in this case, the shock is the Great Recession. Did the city bounce back? Did it flip to a new stable state? Or did something else weird happen? And more importantly, what happens to the economic performance of cities as their structure was changed during the shock? So along with Shri and Feng Wu at the Decision Theater and Ann Kinzig at the School of Life Sciences, we did a great study where we measured the yearly change in over 900 US urban areas over a 17-year period. And we partly chose this period to make sure it captured the time era of the Great Recession. And the result is 926 different response curves, each one visualizing the dynamics of a single urban economy. And then to try to tease out some generalities from all of those results, we performed clustering analysis on the response curves and came up with just 6 of what I called dynamics archetypes. So in general, there were 6 ways that cities responded to the Great Recession. And these curves represent those 6 types of cities. Each one is the average curve of all the cities in the cluster. And there's 3 vertical lines added. The furthest one on the left is the beginning of the Great Recession. The middle is the boundary between the end of the shock period and the beginning of the recovery period. And then the line on the far right in each graph, vertical line, is the end of the recovery and the overall recession. So some interesting things pop out from these results. First, clusters 1 and 3 on the screen sort of correspond to almost any classical text on system resilience. Cluster 1 seems to have been pushed by the shock to a new stable state. It's sort of flat. The shock comes along, it jumps up in accumulated change and then it flattens out again. Whereas cluster 2 seems to have been pushed away from an initial state by the shock, and then the structures of those cities slowly return back to its original state. And meanwhile, there's some other interesting things that came out of this. Cluster 5 is a group of cities that didn't seem to experience change at all over the entire study period for the data we had. Even during the shock, it just wasn't affected. And then cluster 2 down in the lower right corner is interesting because it was undergoing some pretty rapid change before the shock. The recession hits, and then it seems to sort of be frozen in time ever since. It never has changed. What does that mean? I don't know. These are really interesting results that we need to follow up on and find out what's driving these dynamics. So we proposed this sort of typology of cities based on how their structures responded to the shock. But what we really wanted to know was how those structural changes related to changes in performance. And so in this figure, we overlay GDP growth on the two separate parts of the shock. What happened to the cluster's average GDP during the shock phase and then during the recovery phase? And I know there's lots of ways to assess performance of an economy, but GDP offered us an easy starting point, and it's a widely used metric of performance. So if you look at the two classical notions of resilience, cluster 1 and 2, the one that was bumped to a new stable state and the one that returned to a previous state, they actually didn't do so well economically. In fact, the archetype 3, the one that bounces back to a previous state, had one of the worst net changes in GDP of all the cities. And so this was our first hint that maybe this classical notion of resilience as bouncing back to some initial state might not always be a good thing. And in fact, it was only cluster 4 there in the middle bottom that had a positive net change in GDP over the full course of the shock. So in trying to interpret these results, we believe there's a problem with the way resilience is conceptualized in a lot of traditional notions and images. The idea of fixed basins of attraction are pretty pervasive in resilience literature. You have these ball and curve diagrams of balls falling into pits. But instead of those ideas, that there's one or more equilibria that a shocked system will settle in, we really like this paper by LeBoy and Fannin, who asserted that a more accurate depiction of real-world systems is what they call a shifting stability domain. Yes, systems are constantly changing and evolving and moving, but so is the environment that they're in, or the fitness landscape in which that system is embedded. So you might push a system away from one basin, but in the future, that basin doesn't even exist to return to. Things are shifting. And we thought this was probably what we're seeing in the real data, in our data. And so in that type of co-evolving system and environment, the archetype that was most successful economically exhibited this sort of slow but constant change. And so one could argue that being adaptive is actually more important than being resilient. And I know there's a lot of baggage attached to each of those terms, and so that needs some disentangling. But if I were to sum it up in one word, agility is what seems to be important for preserving function and performance. And so I guess a policymaker might take away from this that they should try to manage for not resilience or some particular metric of resilience, but instead create institutions and management structures that are agile. And so I'm at the end here. Last slide, I promise. Some of the applications I haven't done yet, but would like to, are extensions of the two applications I described already. So for instance, instead of mapping how a city can move from one industry structure to another, we could map the transition of one occupation to another. And for instance, we could say what jobs are closest and least costly for unemployed coal miners to transition into. Or let's say a firm occupying one area of a technology network wants to branch out and diversify and grow. Well, what products should it produce? What products are close enough to its current technologies that it could do so pretty painlessly? And second, instead of measuring the change of a city's industrial structure over time, we can do things like measure occupational structure over time. This picture on the lower left is what accountants were like 100 years ago. And I put this up because I used to be an accountant in a former career. And so there are occupations that change really rapidly, and we could identify those. And that's important because we might find that the skills requirements of some jobs or college degrees are changing so quickly that curriculum is not keeping up and needs to be updated. So those are just a few of the possibilities of this work. And my hope is that some of the people listening right now will have ideas of their own, and they'll want to collaborate. And so if you do, here's my email. And before I stop, I really want to thank all the agencies that funded this work. And especially I want to thank Keith Waters, who's a postdoc researcher based at ASU's DC campus and has worked with me on these things for years. And finally, before we move into questions, I just want to make you aware of the upcoming talks in this series. Please come support our faculty. They're really interesting research happening here at the School of Complex Adaptive Systems, so you won't want to miss these. And that's it. I'll leave that up for a little as we go into question mode, and then I'll take it down in a little bit. So Natasha?
Sure. So we have already 2 questions in the chat. And unless someone wants to present the question themselves, I'm happy to read them from the chat. It looks like the first question, and I do apologize if I don't pronounce this correctly, is from Swanand. And I'll go ahead and read that. So the first question is there a structure in which resilience and adaptability, the way in which these terms are measured currently, are positively correlated?
I think that's a difficult question to answer because we're not giving a value specifically to the structure that we could correlate with performance. We're giving a value to the change in structure, how rapidly it and how much it's changing, and correlating that change with performance. So I think what the questioner is asking is if there is an optimal structure that is better for resilience than others. And that I don't know. My gut instinct is to say, yes, there's been some really good work that actually evolves networks through social simulation to be optimal for some performance. Whether those networks are resilient or not, hasn't been tested. So I think that it is possible to have an optimal network structure, and it's also possible to have a resilient network structure. Not so sure how they correlate though.
Okay, great. Unless there's any follow-up to that question, I have a couple more here. The next one is from Margaret, and she asked, sorry, it just ran away from me. Did you share the cluster results with any economic, government, leaders of the cities you studied to see if they could offer additional local explanations for the trends that you observed?
So not yet. We did try to dig into a couple case studies and find out what was happening in those cities that might have caused them to be in one cluster and not another. But at this point, the results are so new that we haven't actually gone out and sought funding to start interfacing with government agencies. And before I would do such a thing, I would want to really do more research and have my story much clearer and ready to try to answer their questions and try to anticipate what they might want out of those results. Because there's always a danger of just giving new results to policymakers and them acting on it without any of us collectively really understanding what it means. And so you can end up making worse decisions with data than you did without data.
Okay, and great. I will go to our third question in the chat, and then I'll open it up to any other questions that participants might have. So unless Stacy, unless you'd like to read, ask your question yourself, I'll go ahead and read it. What are some examples of cities in cluster 5 which were not affected by the recession? This is actually 2 parts, so I'll stop there.
I apologize. I should have anticipated that people would want to know some examples of what were in the individual clusters, and I don't have that on my screen at the moment, but I do recall that they were a bit smaller than the average city size, and that the industries that were there weren't really that tightly connected. So it might be a little bit of manufacturing and some services and some agriculture, but not highly integrated, so that the shocks of the recession cascaded through their economies. And I'm really generalizing there and going out on a limb, but I'll be happy to send you the full data. I can't remember if we published that as supplemental information, but of course we have a list of every US metro and micro area and which cluster they fall into.
I will say you pretty much touched on the second part of her question, which was what were the main types of industries there and what can that suggest for transitions? So great. So I will now just open up. Those were our questions from the chat. If anybody would like to ask a question out loud, now will be your time to do so.
Don't be shy.
Hello, Shade. Thank you very much for your talk. That was very interesting. I've got one question to these clusters you showed us. The measure you presented was cumulative change. Could you specify this a little bit more? So what sort of change was measured there?
So if you go back to this point I made that we can measure the distance between two entities, it's simply the accumulation of distance over time as an entity moves through that network. So in a physical map, you might graph the distance that a person has walked every few minutes, and that you could graph that on a y-axis. And like I said, it's hard to visualize in a network, but you can do the same thing. So the city can move further and further away in the network from its original position. And that accumulated change is simply that amount of distance that it has moved through the network. It's a very abstract notion and it's hard to wrap your head around, I realize, when it's in a network and not a physical space. But distance in this case is synonymous with change, how much the structure has changed.
Okay, so I think it would make sense to sort of classify what kind of changes are behind these cumulative changes you presented. So it's probably quite huge difference if it's, I don't know, if a region is changing from let's say coal to knowledge industry, or from accounting to whatever, right?
Yes.
So do you see any chance to clarify this, or to introduce some measures of what kind of change we can see there?
Absolutely, because all of the change is based on very fine detailed data of specifically which industries fell out of the economy, which new ones came in. Each time that happens, that increases the distance from the original position. And so change is not only an aggregate measure of distance, it's a list of historical falling out and coming into the economy, which we can preserve as a vector, and we could compare that to cities. So we could ask questions, for instance, those cities that were in cluster 3 or 4 or another one, when they were changing, were there specific sectors that seemed to be falling out and coming in, or was it just sort of random? My hunch is that there are specific sectors that are behind these changes. So the data is all there. It just hasn't really been analyzed at that level of detail yet.
Okay, so my suggestion would be to seek for, or to cluster these changes, qualitatively. So what kind of changes are there behind, instead of just presenting the cumulative change?
It's a great idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Olga.
Okay. Looks like Brian, you have your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, so I liked your picture of kind of changing fitness landscapes, and it just got me wondering whether you think that you could ever make this into a kind of predictive model where you try to infer that that fitness landscape and try to predict, what this city is about to transition into a new type of economy, this kind of thing.
But personally, with my skill and ability and my knowledge of this field, I would say hard no. I don't see any situation where I would be able to tell a city, not only you're going to go here, but the environment you're in is going to go here. It's such a dynamic and fluid environment that I wouldn't even know really how to go about predicting the actual how changes in the landscape. And I think that policymakers must be a little bit in the same boat, which is why we saw that one specific cluster, which I call the agile, slow but steady movement cities, doing the best performance-wise, because maybe that's the best you can do in such a dynamic environment, is just be ready for change and always on the edge of change. I keep harping on that word, but agility seems to have just come out as this natural description of what was optimal.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
But I'm sure if you came up with a way to predict the fitness landscape, you'd probably be on your way to a Nobel Prize.
All right, I do see that there are a couple of questions in the chat, and we'll get to those. I see that Sander has his hand up, so see if you'd like to ask your question.
Well, I think it would be interesting to see if you could look at relatively neighboring cities, and in particular major cities and minor cities around them, and begin to follow how the dynamics of innovation, which I think you know a lot about, more than I do, but how those dynamics have actually changed the relative volumes or the relative importance of individual industries in those particular cities. What I seem to recall from the work that I've done a long time ago is that you might have a core city, which is a major one, which does a lot of the actual innovating. And then you actually see some of the subsidiary industries moving to adjacent smaller centers. And I wonder whether from that dynamic, you might ultimately be able to distill some not general rules, but rules for within those particular clusters for particular industries.
That is actually an analysis we're doing right now. It's similar. It's not exactly what you said. First off, we have the issue that our units of analysis are metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, which are designed to encapsulate an entire labor market. So it could be that the entire effect you're describing is within that same unit of analysis, so we can't tease it out. But I don't think that's the case. I think that as you say, the innovation happens in an innovative core and diffuses and has impacts on spatially nearby other urban areas. And we're actually using a designation from the USDA that classifies not only cities, but every county in the US as either urban, rural, and as either adjacent or not to a major metropolitan area. And so we're trying to tease out how that classification manifests across those typologies we found. So do rural counties that aren't near any major urban areas seem to fall in one of those clusters or not? And if so, then we can finally start to tie some of what we're seeing to geographical contingencies. So right now, geography doesn't come into play.
No, I understand.
But it has to at some point. We just don't know yet how it does.
I'm asking because there is a very interesting study done in France a number of years ago already, where that dynamic is actually being analyzed. I don't right now have the reference in mind anymore because this is probably about 10 years ago, but I can find that and I will send it to you because I thought that was indeed an interesting sort of, not a hard statistical model, but something that got us quite a lot closer to what has been happening. And it goes back several centuries, which is the other nice thing about it.
Yeah, I would love to see that.
I'll get it for you, no problem.
All right, I see Joshua has a question in the chat, but it looks like it was discussed in that last question. But if Joshua, if that didn't answer completely your question, please let us know if you wanted to kind of follow up. But I think that was covered in what was just discussed. I was asking about exploring the geographical distributions of the clusters correlated, and I think that's what we just chatted about.
Yeah, thanks Shade for that. And yeah, I think that was pretty much covered in your response to Sandy.
But you do bring up a good point that there are so many directions now to go with this research after the initial study that we're not sure where to go next, other than to look for funding to do something.
Sure.
But yeah, one of my main hangups is that we didn't really consider geography at all, and spatial autocorrelation and these type of things, which really need to enrich any type of framework we hope to come out of this.
Yes.
Great. We have a question also in the chat from Pooja. She said, thank you for the talk. And how would you define adaptive capacities versus resilience capacities?
Oh, that's a good question. That's something I've been like staying up at night thinking about lately. I feel like we've been through this era of sustainability where humanity had a goal of implementing policies so that we don't change the environment so much that it affects human life. And then that era kind of came and went. And then the era of resilience came where we said, okay, well, it's too late to implement policies that don't affect the global system. So our new approach is to implement policies so that at least we don't have to feel the effects in human systems. We can sort of isolate ourselves and put buffers and et cetera. And I almost feel like that window of opportunity has passes by as well. And now we're in the area of adaptation where the policies and strategies we use can no longer try to isolate us from the impacts of a changing global system, but instead embrace those changes and incorporate them into our strategies for living, for surviving. And so that, I guess the difference between resilience and adaptive capacity is, one is the ability to withstand shocks, and the other is the ability to sort of ride the wave and go along with the shock with the minimal disruption. And I know these are really colloquial terms, and it's not, I haven't thought this out really well, and so I hope you'll forgive me.
Right, and we did have a question that came in a little bit earlier from Michelle. And she wrote, in Shutter's Kandala Way and Kinzig 2021, what were some of the structural elements you included in your definition of the economic structure of cities? I'm not familiar enough with the area to imagine and consider them in relation to the economic recovery.
So that's a great way to talk about one of the main differences between a geographical map and the ones we're using in networks is the substrate, what's at the bottom of the map. In traditional maps, it's basically the surface of the earth. In our maps, we can change that up. We've used industries, skills, occupations. Each of those types of entities has its own structure, the different dimensions of the structure of an urban economy. In that particular paper, we used industrial employment. So how did different industries come into and leave a city over time? And how are those industries interacting either positively or negatively? I know it's probably confusing because some of the diagrams I showed were from another paper using skills as that foundation or the substrate that we built on. So yeah, a long way to say that industries were the basis of structure in that paper.
Thank you, Shade. That does help. And I appreciate your responding to that question. At the risk of horning in too much, the one that I just put in the chat, I'm actually even more intrigued by. Is as a clarification, the three errors. Have you written about that? Is that something that those distinctions?
I've written about that in my little black book, and I've shared it with an editor at PNAS who kind of said, "Whoa, this is kind of controversial. Maybe you should flesh this out and let's see what we can do." But other than just like, toiling away in my office here and thinking about it, I haven't written anything. In fact, you're the first people I've even mentioned it to, because I figured immediately I would get hammered, and a lot of people would say that's nonsense and it's not too late, or your definition of resilience is wrong. There's a million things you could attack, but I can't help thinking that certain windows of opportunity have come and gone. And I'd like to actually see this in a citation study, because there was an explosion and exponential growth in the term sustainability in the 90s, and then resilience in the 2000s, and I assume adaptation and adaptive policies will be next. Does that mean that we've, those windows of opportunity have closed and we've moved on to the next? Because honestly, after adaptation, I don't know what comes next other than extinction. If we don't adapt, probably won't go completely extinct, but it would be so radically different from what we consider humanity now that I don't want to think about it.
But I hope you will keep thinking about at least the first three, Shade. That seems quite useful. Thank you.
And I think before that, there was even an era, the pre-sustainability era of ecological thinking. People were sort of groping for something related to the health of the planet and how it related to human health, but it hadn't crystallized yet until sustainability came along and became a thing.
Okay, great. There are no other questions in the chat. I will note, if you're not actively looking at the chat, there is from Ted he says there's a useful reference from Oxfam. It's called Absorb, Adapt, Transform, Resilience Capacities, and there's a link in there. So again, if you're not active in the chat, you may want to pop in there. It looks like you dropped in a link. And then
Thanks,
just
Ted.
yeah, and if anybody has any additional questions.
So please drop me a line, email me. Let's talk about how to collaborate.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, oh, okay, great. People are just saying thank you in the chat. If there are no further questions, I think we'll go ahead and end the meeting.
Thank you everyone for coming too.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much, Shade.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye, everybody.